view of science was seen very much as the ally of upper-class law and order. In other words, mechanical science meant that matter was essentially controlled by knowers from outside and had no autonomy or life of its own. And that's basically the way the political elites wanted to look at the masses. They wanted to look at the masses the same way in which this model of science wanted to look at matter, as something that is governed by outside of it but has no life or autonomy of its own. And so increasingly, those scientists who wanted to really ally themselves with the ruling class elites opted for that kind of model of mechanical science rather than science which believed in much more living and autonomous system. So at least according to this author, that Newton himself essentially censored his alchemistic proclivities and presented himself as a mechanist, very much not as a scientific decision, but as a political decision. Now, what are the implications of that kind of analysis of science? It's a little bit like some of the critique of Freud that has gone on recently, where, for example, there was a whole investigation of Freud's whole view of childhood or infant sexuality and fantasies of the infant and sexual desires toward parents and so on. And it became apparent that in the actual research that Freud had done, what he actually was originally basing his research on was a number of statements by women in his counseling who essentially told him that they had been sexually abused by their fathers or older male relatives as children. And so he was formulating a paper in which he was going to propose to his learned male colleagues that sexual abuse in childhood was a major source of female neurosis. But then he got a terrible case of apprehension, because he feared that his colleagues, obviously his learned male colleagues, would scoff at him for such a theory, and he would be ridiculed. And so he changed his entire interpretation of this data and instead went in with the thesis that neurosis was essentially rooted in infantile sexual fantasy. In other words, he essentially attributed these stories of sexual abuse by these women to their fantasies rather than to actual experience. And from this, we have gotten, of course, 100 years of a certain type of certain type of psychotherapy, which has focused on blaming the victim. That is to say, blaming victimized children for fantasizing about sexuality rather than looking at the possibility that indeed they were actually victimized. Again, the decision for a certain kind of so-called scientific interpretation was not scientific. It was socio-political. It was in terms of what would sell to his colleagues. And he decided that the interpretation that these women had indeed been victimized would not sell. Now, all of this, I think, indicates that we have to look at the value context of science, and this is essentially what I think Deborah Fink was talking about. And I think that means that we have to question the fundamental underlying paradigm of knowledge of modern science, which is based on the fact-value split, or is the basic assumption that authentic knowledge is the sort of knowledge from which you separate yourself. You claim to have no investment, no commitment, that you are essentially the detached observer, and you produce a kind of knowledge which is fundamentally value-free. It may be used for good or evil, but the knowledge itself is essentially simply objectively true, and that is its value, and it does not have to be examined in terms of its social context. And I think what's being questioned here is that kind of model of value-free science, that in fact what we know and the questions that we choose to ask are always governed by a certain kind of social context. It's not simply that they can be used for good or evil, but the very content of the knowledge itself is fundamentally limited and shaped by the kind of rationales of funding, the kind of rationales of social context in which it itself is produced. And the question is not to deny that kind of context of social interest, but rather to acknowledge it up front and then to ask the value questions about it. You know, is this a good context? Is this, what kind of effects does this have? And we have to build those kind of social questions into the very nature of research itself. Now, in this context, I'd like to say a little bit about the science-religion split, because part of the framework of the fact-value split in the modern scientific paradigm is also related to the science-religion split. And I think in the history of science, and certainly I myself sort of bought some of this, there has been an assumption that science sort of forged on bravely with a kind of methodology for ascertaining truth, which was, you know, objective and value-free, and therefore it left religion behind as superstition, sort of sadly, you know, trying to protect its outworn ideas and so on, which have been disproved by science. And I think, again, some of the kind of research that I was reading, some of the work that Berman has done, suggests that a somewhat different reality actually underlay the science-religion split in 17th century England, and that this was not so much science forging ahead and leaving religion sadly behind, as a kind of mutual split between science and religion, each of which, in effect, opted to keep their spheres separate from each other in order to have, shall we say, a kind of separation of turf. And he cites a number of instances of very close collaboration of leading clergymen and scientists and so on in really mutually reinforcing a view of science as purely factual without any value or religious dimension to it, in order precisely that the church could have control over the religious sphere, and science could clearly divorce itself from religion and claim the fact sphere, and each of them would have control over their own areas of turf, so to speak, and both of them could in turn attack and undermine all of those rival theories, which not only brought fact and value together, but were in effect posing themselves as both rival religion and rival science. So that there was much more of a collaboration of established science and established religion in creating this kind of mutual separation. And I think the effect of that is not only that religion sort of focused in on a sphere that no longer dialogued with science and no longer really tried to create a holistic point of view, but that increasingly religion relegated its concepts of ethics and salvation to the private sphere of human life. In other words, it pretended that you could simply be moral and religious in a private vacuum, unrelated to the social context. So one has also, you might say, parallel to the fact-value split, the public-private split, in which religion concentrates religiosity in the private realm, and again claims that religion is fundamentally apolitical or non-political. When I think about this, I think about the almost absurd kinds of power struggles that have gone on in terms of the Vatican and liberation theology, in which one of the major objections of the present papacy and Vatican to various kinds of priests who have been involved in politics. And one of the examples of this was a whole kind of struggle between the Vatican and some of the, really the three priests that took their positions as members of the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. And all of those priests were essentially told that they either would leave political office or they would be disenfranchised from their orders. And none of them accepted to leave their political office. Now that the Sandinistas are out of government, the Maryknoll order has applied that Miguel Diskoto, who of course was the minister, foreign minister for the Sandinistas, be reinstated in the order. In other words, the orders themselves have never accepted this disenfranchisement, but the Vatican has refused to allow Diskoto to be re-acknowledged as a member of the Maryknoll order, somehow on the assumption that even though he's in fact no longer in government, he hasn't really repented of being political. Now, one of the things that's interesting is that the basic declaration here is that there must be a complete separation between religion and politics, and therefore a priest cannot be a member of a government or a political leader. Now, this is very interesting because, of course, the Pope is himself the head of a government. It's called the Vatican State. And so what we really have here is again, a kind of ideology that disguises under the rubric of apolitical, really disguises the actual question, which is what kind of politics. There's church politics on behalf of a certain kind of institutional status quo is not fundamentally challenged. What is challenged is any kind of politics on behalf of social transformation. Now, it seems to me that one of the things that's going on in a whole kind of conversation that I think is linking science and religion and ecology and feminism, many of these things back together again, is really questioning some of these paradigms of knowledge. Questioning the fact of value split, insisting that we really have to recognize that any kind of knowledge is always produced in the context of interests, and rather than deny that, we have to really question, we have to find the kind of ethical means by which to evaluate good and bad politics, good and bad ethical kinds of involvements. In other words, what kind of research on pesticides is in fact promoting socially evil effects, and that we have to build in those kinds of questions of value, really in terms of all of the areas of research. In other words, I would suggest that every department in the university needs to have as part of its teaching the ethics of that area. I mean, that we can no longer afford to have schools of law that do not really build in legal ethics, or medical schools that don't have questions of medical ethics, and so on. To really look at the ethical context, not only of the use of the knowledge, but the very production of the knowledge itself. And with that, I think that we are also raising these kinds of questions about the split of mind and matter, and the whole paradigm of the disinterested observer over against a dead world, and beginning to look at the way in which that very paradigm of knowledge is rooted in a certain kind of pattern, to some extent of gender, but certainly also of class exploitation. And a more participatory kind of understanding of knowledge, a greater sense of life as inherent in the very systems of nature itself, also forces us to have a more responsive and interactive way of questioning and interrelating with each other and with the world around us. Thank you.
Okay, if my watch is correct, we have about 20 or 25 minutes for discussion amongst all of us. You've all been very patient. But before we open it up to you, I'd like to give Deb and Pat a chance to respond briefly, if they would.
Well, I think we've all been talking about knowledge and public accountability and knowledge as a basic value and what we mean by that and the way we can stand back and consider knowledge. And so I guess I'm mostly interested in discussion.
Do you want to say something?
Yeah, hi. You mentioned, Dr. Ruther, you mentioned about the priest in Santa Ynez government and Vatican being opposed to it. Is that just because of their specific beliefs, or would Vatican be opposed to, like, say, some priest wanting to become an American congressman?
No, this was presented as a universal principle. The basic argument had nothing to do overtly, although I think in fact it did have something to do with reality, in relationship to Santa Ynez program as opposed to something else. The principle that was being defended here is that there should be no priest in government. Whether that priest be, the fascist government or Santa Ynez government. So that was the principle that was being argued. And that was also used to remove Congressman Griman. That was a Jesuit representative from the state of Massachusetts. He was forced to resign. And there was also tussles with several nuns who had government positions as well. And so there has been this kind of general claim that nuns and priests should not be in any government office. It had nothing to do, presumably, with the particular theology of that government. So that's the official line. But the reality, as I said, I think is much more contradictory to that. Because obviously the Pope himself is the first example of a political figure. He is himself a head of government. The Vatican is not simply a church, it is a state. And the Pope obviously operates as a very political figure. And yet the contradiction between saying when Mr. can't be in political office because of this principle that priests cannot be in political office, but I mean, it's kind of like it wasn't mentionable. But I think the reality is that there was particular pressure on figures who were in governments and who were taking positions that were more progressive. No doubt about
Just briefly comment on that.
it. Okay.
The principle as such is not new. It's what has happened is that something has been reaffirmed that apparently for some time was not. But in fact, there was, for example, in the 30s, a prime minister of Austria who was also a priest, who was part of a fascist government that had an important role in suppressing the social democratic movement at the time. And he also was, by more or less mutual consent, he was not forced out, and he retained his close ties to the right-wing clergy and so on. But he was also asked not to perform his priestly function while he had a political office. So it's not as though this is a totally new development out of the blue.
Sure, yeah. But obviously there have been priests who have office for a long time. You go back to Cardinal Richelieu and various people who were prime ministers of France. But I think what's more deeply concealed here is the fact that religion is intrinsically political. And so there's an attempt to act as though religion is somehow a purely spiritual matter that is politically neutral or really unrelated to politics. And the reality is that religion is always related to one political stance or another. And so the issue is not political versus apolitical, but the issue is really to examine what kind of politics. Is it the politics of justice or the politics of injustice? I mean, this is the question, and liberation theology, of course, is raising that issue. I mean, it's denying this kind of notion that religion is kind of can be separable in that way, and it's asking the questions of what kind of politics is religion serving? Is it serving a more just society, or is it serving a society, of exploitation and domination and teaching victims to be passive and so on? Yeah?
It just seems when, as you're saying that in fact that's the same issue that we were dealing with knowledge and academia and politics, that as you said before, there was that kind of split. But as I see it, when we start talking about research and we're talking about where the money comes from to do the research, and you mentioned, Dr. Fink had mentioned democratic science, and Dr. Schwann had talked about public input, and those are all nice ideas, but I get worried because, like, within the context of this patriarchy that you were talking about yesterday, all of this is nice ideas, but the reality is the control still, those guys still have the control, right? The guy that owns McDonnell Douglas is the guy that's going to pay to have the research done. And so I just keep getting stuck.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's the question of where universities draw the line in terms of accepting research that's going to be so biased in order to validate the results of certain kinds of government interests or corporation interests and so on. And you can't avoid at that point asking the ethical questions. What is this going to serve in terms of the larger human good and so on?
But haven't we been asking those questions for 1,000 years and not getting them?
Okay, on that, I think too, one thing that you could do, so you're going to take money from McDonnell Douglas, you could say that this is the research and this is the perspective that was put forward by McDonnell Douglas, and it has to be interpreted and read in that context, rather than saying this is the truth.
And there was a little truth in labeling, would at least help. My husband had a little period. He taught at American University in Washington for a while, and then for a couple of years, he went with a social science research company. And then he left it because it became apparent that it was impossible to do independent research in the context where you were getting money from the government, which really were in effect demanding that you come up with certain results. And there were one study that he worked on in terms of violence in schools, and it was being funded by certain kinds of agencies in government that wanted to increase police control and so on. And so they essentially wanted the research company to show that there was a need for this. And his research showed that there wasn't a need for it, and so they just changed the findings. And that was the breaking point when he realized that all the research he'd done had simply been invalidated and the opposite results found because that's what the people who were coming wanted.
thing that seems to be the question, the answer I'd like to find most is how a university actually constitutes itself so that it could ask ethical questions about the research. It seems to me Dr. Swan wouldn't have been hired if they had a suspicion that she'd be likely to cancel certain kinds of research because she thought it was unhealthy to do. I don't think the definition of why we do research at the university was likewise it should cross the road to get to the other side. Well, chickens don't do that. They go across the road. There's something they want to eat on the other side or something. I don't know anybody in the university who does research to get knowledge. I think that's absolutely just has nothing to do with it. I think that may be what we like to talk about, but people in Greece, I've been at the universities for 25 years. I only know people who do research because they get fired if they didn't, right? Or they would have less prestige if they didn't. Most of my friends would rather sell antiques or go swimming or read books. They do research because, in fact, they would lose their jobs if they didn't. And most of them don't do that much after they get tenure. Some go on doing it because, in fact, they find they have wonderful positive response from other people. But they do it because of the social responses to it, not because they like knowledge. They do like knowledge. And discovering something new is wonderful. But they do it because they get tremendous prestige, they get advancement, they get salary, and so on like that. They get fired if they don't. They do the rest of the research in general in ways that society wants to reconfirm the situation that's set up now. Very few people are funded. We have a tremendous problem in this country in health. We have a vast number of people who don't get health services. We have a tremendous number of people who can't get to doctors. We don't have anybody in this university of sociology studying why we don't have enough doctors. Most people I know think we have too many doctors. We have vast number without housing. We don't do research on how to give them housing. We have, this university, set up the use of oil fertilizers and pesticides. We've done it, the whole thing, since 1945, we've done it. Not that we've driven the small farmers out. We've done the research that's gotten us the biggest money, the biggest contracts, and that's what the university wants. Now, my question is, how could we have a structure, what if the university could allow us to, let's say, genuinely question whether irradiating food is healthy or not? That's not being investigated. We're going to investigate how to do it efficiently, how to make money at it. Are we going to investigate what the long-term effects are? How can we have a structure that might endanger our possibility of having money on campus for a new building with people in it to get irradiated themselves? Is there any structure we can have that would open that up? I'm asking all three.
Okay.
The question is to what, let me just take one of your questions you did ask, Sarah. The question as to whether or not irradiating the food is healthy is an important question. As a nutritionist, I would of course believe that. I believe it is an important question to investigate. I, as a nutritionist, have raised it in national circles, in Washington, in local circles, everywhere I've been since I was a graduate student. I have pursued inquiry, have urged others to pursue inquiry, have held and participated in meetings on the subject. I think that's how we do it as a community scholar. We're here for issues, bring to bear whatever we can bring to bear on it by way of our own knowledge and understanding.
Well, that's positive activity. That kind of initiative is really important, and that's how we can get some of those things. My mother quit smoking in 1949 because she read all this stuff about smoking and eating bad. It took another, how many, 40 years before the Surgeon General could actually say, don't smoke, it's bad. The pesticides, the man who had, well, I lecture in Lush Auditorium. There's a big bronze plaque on the wall that says Lush Auditorium was purchased in part of the university's profits on its patent on stilbestrol. Stilbestrol was going to be driven off the market until an ISU researcher came up with a way of making it liquid rather than patent form, and it lasted another 7 years, and that was that many more women whose daughters had the cancers that came from it. Is there a way, my real question is there a way we can have a structure that would allow people who wanted to question those things a real opportunity, real money to go questioning them, not to leave it to the initiative of somebody who wanted to take it up? The individual initiative isn't real important when you have vast amounts of funding from chemical companies.
It seems to me the question is how does the money, which serves the interests of the few, profits of the few, get counteracted by the interests of the majority? And I think that's really what Deborah Reed was asking about in terms of democratic research. Whether the question is, how, I mean, the fact is, that the vast majority of us, I suppose even finally, the people who produce this radiation are not served by having irradiated food. So how do the interests of that vast majority somehow get represented to counteract what is obviously deleterious, but is serving the very short-term interests of people who are producing certain kinds of chemicals. And I suppose, a partial answer, I'm not sure it's adequate, is for certain efforts to have broader